Hey, this is Mike Gerstein. I'm doing a series of recordings for community informatics, courses that I'm teaching on Introduction to Community Informatics. This discussion is associated with Module 1, which is Introduction to Community Informatics and theories on community informatics, community networking, and so on. And I'm talking now with Professor Michael Arnold of the University of Melbourne, who will give a brief introduction to himself. Michael.
Thanks, Michael. I'm in the History and Philosophy of Science program at the University of Melbourne, but I've got a particular interest in technology rather than an interest in history and philosophy of science as such. Within that field, the social implications of technology is my main field of research and also my main field of teaching. Hence my interest in community informatics.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Now, how do you understand the concept of community?
It's the most important and profound thing about community, I think, is the notion that it is a form of sociality. Now, that sounds ordinary. Of course it is. It's people together, but it's as an ideal. That notion of people coming together in this particular form, in the form of a community, I think is very important. So there are other forms of sociality, of course. There are other formations, such as a network, such as a family, such as a society or a corporation or company, a club, etc., etc. But a community is a particular form of coming together that privileges ideals like solidarity, ideals like having shared interests, and those interests are both subjective interests and objective interests. Interests in water, objective interests like economic interests and infrastructure interests, as well as subjectivities. That it's also a sort of a self-conscious group that's known to itself in so much as the community is aware that it has a shared history, a set of shared interests and a set of shared subjectivities. So that kind of ideal, I think, is what community is all about. Now, I'll just continue going until you interrupt me, Michael, but I think that people often quibble, in my view, that community is has not existed. That community is some sort of pastoral myth. When one dreams of community, one is being fairy-headed. One is not grounded in the reality of day-to-day life and day-to-day sociality. Well. Perhaps that's the case, and I wouldn't particularly want to argue, that point, whether or not this pastoral ideal has ever existed or not. But the fact that it exists in our consciousness as an ideal gives it significance, in my opinion.
Okay, what about community and technology, community and information technology?
Where information technology, where informatics comes into it, what we're looking at is the ways that technology, I'll use a certain form of words and then I'll come back and correct myself if you don't mind. The way communities can use technologies for the purposes that I expressed earlier, as an expression of the ideals that I expressed earlier. So where ICTs, where technologies can be used for people to express their interests, to execute action in their own interests, that is in the interests of the community, where they can use it to express solidarity, where they can use it to establish the common ground, if you like, the common ground that constitutes a community. That's where the ICTs come into it. Now, I'll come back and correct myself because I use the term use, that the community will use the technology, as though the technology is somehow a absolutely faithful servant that explicitly obeys the pure will, the pure desire of the user of the technology, in this case, the community. Now, those of us who've worked with technologies and look closely at technologies see that that's not the case, that technologies are in themselves actors. Technologies push back, if you like. Technologies don't simply obey our pure will. So communities need to, understand that if they're to use technologies to express community interests, that the technologies are going to mediate those interests. The technologies that are going to reorient those interests. That they're not simply going to faithfully translate them, and so there needs to be community informatics is part of the back and forth between the community, the technology, the community, the technology. This back and forth as each is trying to shape the other, if that makes sense. People who are interested in community informatic development are interested in developing technologies, and they set out to do so. They set out to shape the technologies, to design the applications, and to install hardware in certain configurations and what have you. But those applications and that hardware, etc., turns around and reshapes what the community is doing and reshapes the desires and the ambitions of the technologists who are setting out to shape the technology. So when I say community informatics is communities using technology, it's also technology using communities, if I could anthropomorphisize the technology.
How do you understand the term informatics, which is one that's not in general use at this point?
Yeah, it's not, and you would know more about the history of this term than I do. I know it's got a long history in health informatics, for example, in educational informatics, and I guess community the term informatics was butted onto community in the same sort of way as it's butted onto to those other terms like health and education and so forth.
I guess it's often used in the European context as applied technology. Because in Europe they're often looking at it from a more from the perspective of how it's used rather than separating the applications from the infrastructure. So they're looking at some kind of fusion between the two.
Right, that makes sense. And community informatics is, as you know, is very much concerned with application.
Yeah, it fits in with what your earlier definition. Yeah. And what about community networking? Do you have any thoughts about how you would define community networking?
Yeah, a network. It's a really interesting metaphor, this network. Okay, so let's understand it for what it is. It's a metaphor. Now, I can see the attraction in it. It's just so elegant in its simplicity. But a network is comprised of only two elements: a node and a link. And out of those two elements, very, very complex structures are established and can be established. Look at the complexity of social interaction on Facebook, for example, is constituted in just those two things, the node and the link. But the thing about the network is that it's quite different to a community, and I don't think it should be mistaken for a community. What holds the community together is the common ground upon which the members of the community stand. There is no equivalent, in my opinion, in a network. A network is individuated. A network is privatized, in a sense. The network just let me get his name. There's a terrific I think it's a young person that I've just been reading lately. I can't pronounce the name. Mejias, Mejias. Are you familiar with him, Michael?
No, not at all.
No, he's written a PhD and a couple of journal articles, two or three journal articles I've been reading recently. He talks about the nodocentrism of a network, the way the network is nodocentric. So, in this, what one does is one, you know, if we look at me, for example, my network is centered on me as the central node. And I connect to you and I connect to others. I own that network. I connect with those people. It's up to me to maintain that network. It's up to me to establish it, and I can, reshape it at any point. You see how that differs from a community. A community is not owned in that sense by the individual in the way that I am responsible for my network, whether that network is in my diary or in my contacts or on my Facebook or on LinkedIn or in any other sort of way. Outside of the network, we have what this guy calls the paranodal, and the paranodal doesn't exist so far as the network is concerned. So far as the network is concerned, only nodes that are part of the network exist. Others, there's a whole universe out there, that doesn't exist. Now, when we talk here about community networks, it seems to me to be an inappropriate conjunction of terms. As I say, a network is private property. A network is established by the central node. That network, of course, interconnects with all other networks. My network interconnects with your network, and it's overlapping in that sort of sense. But it doesn't share the common ground that a community does. You see?
Just one final, because I want to close this off. Just make some comments on how you would understand community informatics, based on what you've just talked about in terms of communities, informatics, and networks.
Okay. Community informatics is an attempt to negotiate with information and communication systems, or to mediate information and communication systems in order to advance the common ground upon which the community stands. So what one needs to do, if one is interested in community informatics, what one needs to do is firstly try to identify what that common ground is. What are the subjectivities and the objectivities which constitute the common ground upon which the community stands? What are the shared interests, both subjective and objective, upon which the community stands? What is the common history and the common future which constitutes that bounded common ground? And once that has been identified and thought through, one begins to negotiate with the technology and try to press the technology, try to reshape the technology such that it acts in a way that advances the interests of that established common ground. So there's a sort of a double flow through there. If Mike Gerstein is working on a community informatics project, what Mike Gerstein is doing is firstly entering into a series of negotiations with the community about what constitutes that common ground, and along with the community entering into another set of negotiations with the technology. And it cycles, so that cycle of that double loop of negotiating, where you cycle through, Gerstein community, informatics, Gerstein, etc., etc. And that makes it a very challenging and interesting field to be in.
Excellent, thank you, Michael. This is Mike Gerstein talking to Michael Arnold, the University of Melbourne, and this is part of a series of videos on towards community informatics. And I thank you very much.